The houses on Willow Creek Lane stood in neat, unwavering rows, each lawn a verdant carpet meticulously trimmed, each mailbox a shining testament to suburban order. It was the kind of place where power washing your driveway was considered a civic duty, and leaving your garbage cans out past 7 p.m. was an act of social treason. Birds chirped their cheerful melodies from perfectly pruned trees, and the gentle hum of lawnmowers provided a constant, soothing soundtrack to the good life. Or at least, that's how it appeared on the surface. Beneath the veneer of tranquility, a low-grade war simmered, fought over meticulously worded bylaws, strategically placed garden gnomes, and the precise shade of beige permitted for exterior paint. The Willow Creek Homeowners Association, a body usually comprised of well-meaning but occasionally overzealous retirees and ambitious young professionals, held absolute sway over every aspect of life within the community's borders. And, as any resident knew, crossing the HOA was akin to incurring the wrath of a small, very organized, and remarkably persistent god. Enter 15-year-old Ethan, the sheriff's son. Ethan wasn't inherently rebellious, just teenage. His hair, perpetually bordering on too long, was a source of constant contention with his mother. His taste in music leaned towards the louder, more guitar-heavy side of the spectrum, and his commitment to lawn care could charitably be described as developing. He was, in short, a minor affront to the perfectly manicured paradise that Willow Creek aspired to be. He was also blissfully unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon, content to dribble his basketball on the driveway on a sunny Saturday afternoon. The rhythmic thud of the ball against the asphalt was a familiar sound, a comforting counterpoint to the otherwise sterile quiet of the neighborhood. He wore a slightly faded t-shirt advertising a local pizza place, jeans ripped at the knees, and an expression of casual indifference that only a teenager could truly master. He was practicing a new crossover move he'd seen on YouTube, occasionally glancing up to check if his dad's prized rose bushes were still intact. The sheriff, despite his imposing presence and dedication to law and order, was surprisingly attached to his roses. But the peace wouldn't last. A dark blue golf cart, emblazoned with the Willow Creek HOA logo, was approaching, and it was driven by none other than Agnes Plumtree, the self-appointed enforcer of all things orderly and beige, and her equally zealous companion, Bob Jenkins. They were on patrol, ready to find a reason to make someone's day miserable. The subtle, yet palpable tension in the air was about to explode. Ethan, still focused on his crossover, hadn't noticed them yet. His world was about to change, and the quiet suburban life of Willow Creek was about to be turned upside down. The golf cart screeched to a halt at the edge of Ethan's driveway, the suddenness of it making him jump. Agnes Plumtree, her face set in a permanent scowl that seemed etched into her very being, pointed a bony finger at the basketball hoop. "Young man," she barked, her voice surprisingly loud for someone of her diminutive stature. "That hoop is in violation of Bylaw 3.2b, subsection alpha. It's obstructing the view and creating a potential hazard." Ethan, momentarily stunned, stopped dribbling. "Excuse me?" he mumbled, genuinely confused. He'd had the hoop there for years. Bob Jenkins, a man whose primary distinguishing feature was his unwavering agreement with everything Agnes said, nodded vigorously. "And the lawn," he added, his voice a reedy echo of Agnes's. "It's unkempt, certainly not in compliance with the standards of Willow Creek." Ethan glanced down at the grass, which, admittedly, could have used a trim, but it wasn't exactly a jungle. "It's just a little long," he protested. "I was going to mow it tomorrow." Agnes's scowl deepened. "Excuses, excuses, we've heard them all before. The HOA has received numerous complaints about your substandard property maintenance." This was, of course, a blatant lie. The only complaints were the ones Agnes had fabricated herself. "Look," Ethan said, trying to remain calm. "I'm just playing basketball. Can't this wait?" "Absolutely not," Agnes declared, puffing out her chest. "We've been far too lenient. This blatant disregard for the rules will not be tolerated. You are hereby ordered to remove the basketball hoop and mow the lawn immediately." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Seriously? You're going to make me do that right now?" "We are," Bob Jenkins squeaked, stepping forward slightly. "And if I don't?" Ethan challenged, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. That Agnes's eyes narrowed. Then we'll have to take further action. She gestured to Bob, who, with surprising agility for a man his age, grabbed Ethan's arm. Come along now, Agnes said, her voice taking on a chillingly sweet tone. We're going to have a little chat at the HOA office. Ethan, shocked, tried to pull away. Hey, what are you doing? Let go of me. Bob's grip tightened. Just comply, son, it'll be easier on everyone. I'm not going anywhere with you. Ethan yelled, struggling against Bob's surprisingly strong grasp. Agnes stepped closer, her face inches from Ethan's. We're doing this for your own good, she hissed. You need to learn to respect the rules. And with that, they began to drag him towards the golf cart. The rhythmic thud of the basketball, now silent on the driveway, was replaced by the sounds of Ethan's increasingly desperate protests. The storm had broken, and Willow Creek was about to learn that messing with the sheriff's son was a very, very bad idea. I live here, Ethan shouted, his voice cracking slightly as Bob's grip tightened. He twisted, trying to free his arm, but Bob was surprisingly strong. This is my house. I'm Ethan Miller. My dad's the sheriff. Agnes merely chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine despite the warm afternoon sun. Sheriff's son or not, young man, you're not above the rules. We've dealt with rebellious teenagers before. It's always the same song and dance. Show me some ID, Ethan demanded, his adrenaline pumping. You can't just grab people off their own property. What gives you the right? He was genuinely scared now, the casual indifference of a few minutes ago replaced by a rising tide of panic. Bob grunted, tightening his grip even further. We don't need to show you anything. We're acting in the authority of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. We are authorized to enforce the bylaws. Yeah, authorized by crazy people, Ethan retorted, still struggling. I want to see some identification. Are you even security guards? Are you even allowed to do this? Agnes remained unfazed. We are volunteers, dedicated to maintaining the standards of Willow Creek. We don't need badges or fancy uniforms. We have the bylaws on our side, and that's all that matters. She pulled a crumpled pamphlet from her pocket, waving it in the air like a weapon. This is our authority. Bylaw 7.4, subsection Gamma. The HOA reserves the right to take any and all necessary actions to ensure compliance with community standards. Ethan, despite his fear, couldn't help but find the whole situation absurd. He was being manhandled on his own driveway by two overzealous retirees wielding a poorly printed HOA pamphlet. But the absurdity didn't lessen the fear or the burning pain in his arm. Just show me your names, anything, Ethan pleaded, his voice hoarse. How do I even know you're really with the HOA? You could be anyone. Agnes and Bob exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them. Agnes tightened her lips, and Bob simply shook his head, refusing to answer. They weren't going to give him anything, not even their names. They were convinced they were in the right, acting in the best interests of Willow Creek, and nothing he said would change their minds. They continued to drag him towards the golf cart. His feet scraping against the asphalt, he could see Mrs. Henderson, his next-door neighbor, peering out from behind her curtains, her face a mask of shocked curiosity. He wanted to yell for help, but his throat was tight with fear. He was trapped, at the mercy of these two self-proclaimed guardians of suburban order. He just hoped someone would notice, and soon he was running out of time, and he was starting to realize just how serious this ridiculous situation had become. Behind the pristine white curtains of 14, Willow Creek Lane, Martha Henderson wrung her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd been a resident of Willow Creek for over 30 years, and she'd seen her fair share of HOA squabbles. But this was different. This wasn't just a disagreement over flower beds or fence heights. This was, well, it looked like kidnapping. She recognized Ethan, of course. Everyone knew Ethan Miller, the sheriff's son. A good kid, if a bit unkempt, as Agnes Plumtree would undoubtedly say. Martha had always found Agnes to be a bit much, a busybody with an inflated sense of self-importance. And Bob Jenkins? Well, Bob was just Agnes's shadow, agreeing with everything she said like a well-trained parrot. Yes, she watched Ethan being dragged towards the golf cart, his face contorted in a mixture of fear and anger. Martha knew she couldn't just stand by and do nothing. That she'd initially hesitated, fearful of involving herself and potentially becoming a target of the HOA's wrath. But the sight of Ethan struggling, his voice pleading for help, snapped her out of her paralysis. She knew she couldn't confront Agnes and Bob directly. They were too far gone, too convinced of their own righteousness, and she needed to call someone who could actually do something. She needed to call the sheriff. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy as she dialed the number she knew by heart. Sheriff Miller had always been a fair and just man, a pillar of the community. She trusted him implicitly. She held her breath as the phone rang, each ring echoing in the otherwise silent house. She glanced back out the window, her anxiety growing with each passing second. Ethan was still struggling, but his resistance seemed to be waning. Finally, the phone was answered. Sheriff Miller's office, Deputy Johnson speaking. Martha's voice was a shaky whisper. Deputy Johnson, this is Martha Henderson at 14 Willow Creek Lane. I need to speak to Sheriff Miller. It's an emergency. Deputy Johnson, used to dealing with all sorts of calls, remained calm. I'm sorry, ma'am. The sheriff is currently out on a call. Can I take a message? No, you don't understand, Martha stammered, her voice rising in desperation. This can't wait. That it's about his son, Ethan. Agnes Plumtree and Bob Jenkins are. They're dragging him off his property. They're saying it's about HOA violations, but it looks like they're kidnapping him. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Ma'am, are you sure about this? Positive, Martha insisted. Please, you have to get him here right away. I'm afraid something terrible is going to happen. Deputy Johnson, sensing the urgency in Martha's voice, didn't hesitate. Okay, ma'am, I understand that I'll dispatch a unit immediately, and I'll try to reach the sheriff. Just stay on the line and keep me updated. Martha, clutching the phone tightly, returned to the window, her eyes fixed on the unfolding drama across the street. The golf cart was moving now, slowly pulling away from the curb with Ethan still struggling inside. Time was running out. She could only pray that the sheriff arrived in time. Sheriff Miller was inspecting a minor fender bender on the outskirts of town when Deputy Johnson's frantic call came through. The words, Ethan, kidnapping, and Agnes Plumtree formed a bizarre and terrifying cocktail that sent a jolt of ice water through his veins. That he barked instructions into his radio, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage, and spun his patrol car around, sirens blaring, tires squealing against the asphalt. The fender bender, and everything else, was instantly forgotten. His son was in trouble. He tore through the streets of Willow Creek, his mind racing, his imagination conjuring up 1,000 horrific scenarios. He knew Agnes Plumtree. Everyone in Willow Creek did. She was a force of nature, a whirlwind of rules and regulations. But he never imagined she was capable of something like this. As he rounded the corner onto Willow Creek Lane, he saw it. The dark blue golf cart, emblazoned with the dreaded HOA logo, slowly puttering down the street. And inside, struggling against Bob Jenkins's grip, was Ethan. Sheriff Miller slammed on the brakes, the patrol car skidding to a halt in the middle of the road, narrowly missing a perfectly manicured rose bush. He threw the car into park and leaped out, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm, to assess the situation before reacting. That he was a sheriff, sworn to uphold the law, but he was also a father, and the sight of his son being forcibly restrained ignited a firestorm of protective rage within him. He approached the golf cart slowly, his eyes narrowed, his face a mask of thunderous fury. Agnes Plumtree, oblivious to the approaching storm, was lecturing Ethan about respecting community standards. Agnes, Sheriff Miller's voice boomed, cutting through her tirade like a thunderclap. Agnes, startled, turned to face him, her eyes widening in disbelief. Sheriff Miller, what are you doing here? That's my son, Agnes, he said, his voice dangerously low. And it appears you and Mr. Jenkins are forcibly detaining him. Care to explain yourselves? He saw the fear flicker in Agnes's eyes, the realization that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Bob Jenkins, ever the loyal follower, simply stared at the ground, his face pale. Sheriff, there's been a misunderstanding, Agnes stammered, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan was in violation of several HOA bylaws. We were simply escorting him to the HOA office to discuss the matter. Sheriff Miller's gaze hardened. Is that so? And does escorting involve physically restraining him against his will? He turned his attention to Ethan, his eyes filled with concern. Ethan, are you all right? Ethan, his face flushed and his arm bruised, nodded weakly. Yeah, Dad, I'm okay. They wouldn't listen to me. They wouldn't even tell me who they were. Sheriff Miller's jaw tightened. He took another deep breath, struggling to control his anger that he needed to remain professional, to follow the law, but every instinct in his body screamed for him to rip Agnes and Bob limb from limb. Agnes, he said, his voice dripping with icy menace. You and Mr. Jenkins are about to learn a very important lesson, a lesson about the limits of your authority and the consequences of your actions. He reached for his radio. Dispatch, I need backup at 14 Willow Creek Lane that we have 2 individuals in custody for false imprisonment and potentially assault. The quiet suburban life of Willow Creek had just been shattered, and Sheriff Miller was about to make sure that Agnes Plumtree and Bob Jenkins paid the price. The arrival of the backup units only amplified the surreal atmosphere. 2 patrol cars, lights flashing, now blocked Willow Creek Lane, transforming the normally quiet street into a scene from a police procedural. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, began to emerge from their houses, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The perfectly manicured lawns and pristine facades seemed to shrink under the harsh glare of the flashing lights, revealing the cracks and imperfections beneath. Sheriff Miller, his face grim, turned back to Agnes and Bob, who stood frozen in place, their initial bravado completely evaporated. I asked you a question, he said, his voice hard. Why were you detaining my son? Agnes, regaining a sliver of her composure, stammered. Sheriff, we were just enforcing the HOA regulations. He was in violation of several bylaws. Which bylaws, specifically? Sheriff Miller pressed, his eyes boring into her. Agnes hesitated, shuffling her feet nervously. Well, his lawn was unkempt, and the basketball hoop was obstructing the view. So, for a slightly overgrown lawn and a basketball hoop, you felt it necessary to physically restrain him and drag him off his property? Sheriff Miller asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Bob Jenkins, finally finding his voice, squeaked. We were just following protocol. Sheriff, that's standard procedure for repeat offenders. Repeat offender? Sheriff Miller scoffed. My son has never been cited for a single HOA violation. Are you telling me you have a record of previous complaints? Agnes and Bob exchanged a furtive glance. Well, no, not exactly, Agnes admitted. But he's been warned before, verbally. Verbally warned? Sheriff Miller repeated, his eyebrows raised. So, based on a verbal warning, you felt justified in kidnapping my son. He paused, taking a step closer to Agnes. I want to see some identification. Both of you. Driver's licenses, HOA credentials, anything that proves you have the authority to act in this manner. Agnes and Bob hesitated again, their faces turning a shade paler. We don't have any identification on us, Agnes mumbled. We're just volunteers. We don't carry badges or anything like that. Sheriff Miller shook his head in disbelief. So, let me get this straight, that you're telling me you physically restrained a minor, dragged him off his property, and refused to identify yourselves, all based on a verbal warning and a crumpled copy of the HOA bylaws. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. This is unbelievable. You two clearly have no understanding of the law or the limits of your authority. He turned to one of the deputies. Deputy Johnson, read them their rights. Then take them downtown. I want them booked on charges of false imprisonment, impersonating law enforcement, and potentially assault. And I want a full investigation into the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Something tells me this is just the tip of the iceberg. The quiet suburban life of Willow Creek was officially over. The illusion of order and tranquility had been shattered, revealing the dark underbelly of petty power and unchecked authority, and Sheriff Miller was determined to expose it all. Back at the sheriff's office, the investigation into Agnes Plumtree and Bob Jenkins began in earnest. The background check revealed no prior criminal records, but it did uncover something far more disturbing. Neither Agnes nor Bob held any licenses or certifications that would authorize them to act as security personnel or enforce any kind of regulations beyond simply reporting them to the actual HOA board. They were, in essence, glorified hall monitors with delusions of grandeur, fueled by a potent mix of boredom and a desperate need for control. They genuinely believed they were acting in the best interests of Willow Creek, saving it from the creeping menace of unkempt lawns and misplaced basketball hoops. Sheriff Miller, reviewing the files, shook his head in disbelief. These people were playing cop, he muttered to Deputy Johnson. And they almost got away with it. Deputy Johnson nodded grimly. It's not uncommon, Sheriff. You see it in a lot of these HOAs. People get power-hungry, start thinking they're above the law. Further investigation revealed that Agnes and Bob weren't acting entirely alone. While the HOA board hadn't explicitly authorized their vigilante tactics, they had certainly turned a blind eye to their activities, content to let them handle the dirty work of enforcing the community standards. Several board members even expressed their gratitude to Agnes and Bob for their dedication to preserving the quality of life in Willow Creek. Sheriff Miller was appalled. So, the HOA board knew these two weren't licensed or authorized to do what they were doing, and they let them continue anyway. Looks that way, Sheriff, Deputy Johnson confirmed. We're pulling their records now, checking their meeting minutes, emails, everything that I think we're going to find a lot more than just unkempt lawns and misplaced basketball hoops. The investigation quickly expanded beyond Agnes and Bob, focusing on the entire Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Subpoenas were issued, financial records were seized, and residents were interviewed. The carefully constructed facade of Willow Creek was crumbling, revealing a network of petty grievances, power struggles, and questionable financial dealings that it turned out that Agnes and Bob, while perhaps the most extreme examples, were not unique in their zeal. Other HOA volunteers had engaged in similar tactics, harassing residents for minor infractions, issuing fines without proper authorization, and generally making life miserable for anyone who dared to deviate from the community's rigid standards. Sheriff Miller knew that he had stumbled onto something big, something that went far beyond a simple case of false imprisonment. He had uncovered a culture of abuse and intimidation, fueled by unchecked power and a complete disregard for the law, and he was determined to put an end to it. Once and for all, the arrests of Agnes and Bob were just the beginning. The real battle for Willow Creek was just getting started. The booking process was a humiliating experience for Agnes and Bob. Stripped of their HOA authority and facing the reality of their actions, they were reduced to frightened, bewildered individuals. They were fingerprinted, photographed, and forced to surrender their personal belongings, including Agnes's crumpled copy of the HOA bylaws, which Deputy Johnson couldn't help but chuckle at. They were charged with false imprisonment for unlawfully detaining Ethan against his will, impersonating law enforcement for acting as if they had the authority to enforce laws and regulations without proper credentials, and potentially assault. Depending on the extent of Ethan's injuries as they sat in their separate holding cells, the weight of their actions finally began to sink in. They had believed they were doing what was right, protecting Willow Creek from the forces of disorder and decay. But now, they were facing serious criminal charges, their reputations ruined, their lives forever changed. News of the arrests spread like wildfire through Willow Creek. Some residents cheered, finally feeling vindicated after years of harassment and intimidation by the HOA. Others were shocked and dismayed, unable to believe that Agnes and Bob, pillars of the community, could be capable of such actions, and still others remained silent, fearful of drawing the attention of the HOA or the sheriff's department. The arrests of Agnes and Bob sent a clear message. No one, not even those acting in the name of the HOA, was above the law. Sheriff Miller was determined to hold everyone accountable, from the overzealous volunteers to the board members who had enabled their behavior. The investigation continued to uncover more and more disturbing details about the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Financial irregularities were discovered, including questionable spending and inflated invoices. Evidence of selective enforcement of the rules was found, with certain residents being targeted for minor infractions while others, often friends or family of board members, were allowed to flout the regulations with impunity. It became clear that the HOA was not simply a well-meaning organization trying to maintain community standards. It was a breeding ground for abuse of power, corruption, and petty tyranny, and Sheriff Miller was determined to root it out, no matter how deeply entrenched it might be. The arrests of Agnes and Bob were just the first domino to fall. The Willow Creek Homeowners Association was about to learn that their reign of terror was over. The community, long held captive by fear and intimidation, was finally ready to fight back, and Sheriff Miller was ready to lead the charge. The story of the HOA cops and the sheriff's son was tailor-made for the internet. IT had everything: absurdity, outrage, a David and Goliath narrative, and a dash of small-town intrigue. Martha Henderson's daughter, a social media whiz, had posted a brief account of the incident on Facebook, along with a blurry photo she'd snapped from her window. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times, attracting the attention of local news outlets. The local news picked up the story, focusing on the arrests and the ongoing investigation into the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. The sheriff's office, initially reluctant to comment, was soon overwhelmed by media inquiries. Sheriff Miller, a normally private man, found himself thrust into the spotlight, fielding questions from reporters and camera crews. But the story didn't stay local for long. The combination of the sheriff's involvement and the sheer ridiculousness of the situation. Fake HOA cops drag sheriff's son off property over lawn violation proved irresistible to the national media. Cable news channels, morning talk shows, and even late-night comedy programs jumped on the bandwagon. Willow Creek became a punchline, a symbol of suburban excess and the perils of unchecked HOA power. Residents found themselves bombarded with interview requests, their quiet lives turned upside down by the media frenzy. Some embraced the attention, eager to share their stories of HOA abuse. Others retreated into their homes, pulling down their blinds and hoping the cameras would go away. The internet exploded with memes and parodies. Agnes Plumtree and Bob Jenkins became instant celebrities, albeit of the infamy variety. Their faces were plastered on t-shirts, their quotes were remixed into viral videos, and their actions were dissected and ridiculed by armchair commentators around the world. The Willow Creek Homeowners Association, already reeling from the arrests and the investigation, found itself facing a public relations nightmare. Their website was flooded with angry comments. Their social media accounts were inundated with insults, and their reputation was in tatters. They issued a series of carefully worded statements, attempting to distance themselves from Agnes and Bob's actions and promising to cooperate fully with the investigation. But no one was buying it. The media frenzy showed no signs of abating. The story had tapped into a deep vein of resentment and frustration with HOAs, which many people viewed as intrusive, overbearing, and out of touch. The tale of the HOA cops and the sheriff's son became a rallying cry for those who had been victimized by similar abuses of power, and Sheriff Miller, whether he liked it or not, had become a symbol of resistance against the forces of suburban tyranny. The Willow Creek Homeowners Association was in full-blown crisis mode. Their carefully crafted image of suburban perfection had been shattered, replaced by a reputation for petty tyranny and abuse of power. The HOA board, composed of 5 individuals who had previously enjoyed a comfortable level of anonymity, now found themselves the targets of public scorn and ridicule. Their first instinct was damage control. They released a carefully worded statement, expressing their deep regret over the incident involving Ethan Miller and condemning the actions of Agnes Plumtree and Bob Jenkins. The statement emphasized that Agnes and Bob were acting independently and without the explicit authorization of the HOA board. They were rogue volunteers, the statement claimed, who had exceeded their authority and violated the trust placed in them. The HOA also announced that it was launching its own internal investigation into the incident and would cooperate fully with the sheriff's department. They suspended all volunteer enforcement activities and promised to review their bylaws and procedures to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future, but the statement rang hollow. No one, least of all Sheriff Miller, believed that Agnes and Bob were acting entirely on their own. The evidence suggested that the HOA board had at least tacitly approved of their tactics, turning a blind eye to their abuses as long as they were getting results. The sheriff's investigation uncovered a series of emails and meeting minutes that contradicted the HOA's claim of ignorance. In one email, a board member praised Agnes and Bob for their proactive approach to enforcing community standards. In another, the board discussed the need to send a message to residents who were not complying with the rules, and in the meeting minutes, there was a clear pattern of complaints about minor infractions, followed by vague references to appropriate action being taken. Furthermore, several residents came forward with sworn affidavits stating that they had witnessed HOA board members encouraging Agnes and Bob to be more aggressive in their enforcement efforts. One resident claimed that a board member had told Agnes to crack down on homeowners who were letting the neighborhood go to seed. Sheriff Miller knew that the HOA's attempt at damage control was a lie. They were trying to protect themselves from liability and avoid further scrutiny. But he wasn't going to let them get away with it. He was determined to expose the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. The investigation into the Willow Creek Homeowners Association was far from over. The arrests of Agnes and Bob were just the beginning. The real battle was about to begin, a battle for the soul of Willow Creek, a battle between the forces of transparency and accountability and the forces of secrecy and abuse of power, and Sheriff Miller was ready to fight. The deeper Sheriff Miller's team dug into the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, the more dirt they uncovered. What began as an investigation into false imprisonment and assault quickly morphed into a full-blown corruption probe. The financial records, meticulously scrutinized by forensic accountants, revealed a pattern of questionable spending and self-dealing. It turned out that the HOA board members were using their positions to enrich themselves and their friends. They were awarding contracts to companies owned by their relatives, charging inflated prices for services, and pocketing the difference. They were using HOA funds to pay for lavish parties, expensive vacations, and personal expenses. The investigation also revealed a clear pattern of selective enforcement of the rules. Residents who were friends or family of board members were allowed to flout the regulations with impunity, while others were targeted for even the most minor infractions. One resident, a single mother struggling to make ends meet, was fined repeatedly for having an unapproved color of paint on her front door. Another resident, a retired veteran, was threatened with foreclosure for failing to keep his lawn perfectly manicured. The HOA board members were also accused of using their power to silence dissent. Residents who spoke out against their policies were subjected to harassment, intimidation, and even legal threats. One resident, who had started a petition calling for greater transparency in the HOA's financial dealings, had his car vandalized and his property defaced. Sheriff Miller was disgusted by what he was finding. The Willow Creek Homeowners Association was not simply a group of well-meaning volunteers trying to maintain community standards. It was a criminal enterprise, preying on its own residents for personal gain. That he knew that he had to bring these people to justice. He vowed to uncover every last detail of their corruption and hold them accountable for their actions. He assembled a team of experienced investigators and prosecutors, and they began to build a case against the HOA board members. The investigation was long and arduous, but the evidence was overwhelming. The HOA board members were eventually indicted on a variety of charges, including embezzlement, fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. They faced the prospect of years in prison, their reputations ruined, their lives forever changed. The arrests of the HOA board members sent a shockwave through Willow Creek. Residents who had long been afraid to speak out finally felt emboldened to come forward with their stories. The community, long held captive by fear and intimidation, was finally ready to reclaim its future, and Sheriff Miller was determined to help them do it. With the HOA board members facing criminal charges and the media spotlight shining brightly on Willow Creek, the floodgates opened. Residents who had long suffered in silence, fearing retribution from the HOA, finally found the courage to speak out. They lined up outside the sheriff's office, eager to share their stories of harassment, intimidation, and abuse. One by one, they recounted their experiences, the arbitrary fines, the petty rules, the constant surveillance, the sense of living in a police state. They spoke of being afraid to express their opinions, afraid to decorate their homes as they pleased, afraid to even let their children play outside without fear of being reprimanded. An elderly woman, her voice trembling with emotion, described how she had been fined for having a bird feeder in her backyard. The HOA claimed it was attracting rodents, but she suspected it was because she had refused to contribute to a fundraising campaign for the board president's re-election. A young couple, struggling to pay their mortgage, told of how they had been repeatedly fined for minor landscaping violations, even though they had always maintained their property to the best of their ability. They suspected that they were being targeted because they had complained about the HOA's excessive fees. A disabled veteran, his voice filled with anger, recounted how he had been threatened with foreclosure for failing to keep his lawn perfectly manicured, even though he was physically unable to do so, that he felt betrayed by the HOA, which he had once believed was dedicated to serving the community. As the stories poured in, Sheriff Miller realized the full extent of the damage that the Willow Creek Homeowners Association had inflicted on its residents. That it was more than just financial corruption. It was a systematic campaign of abuse and intimidation, designed to silence dissent and consolidate power. He vowed to do everything in his power to help these victims find justice. He assigned a team of detectives to investigate their claims, and he promised to prosecute anyone who had engaged in illegal or unethical behavior. The outpouring of support from the community was overwhelming. Residents organized rallies, started petitions, and launched a fundraising campaign to help the victims pay their legal fees. They were determined to reclaim their neighborhood and create a community where everyone was treated with respect and dignity. The tide had turned in Willow Creek. The days of fear and intimidation were over. The community, once divided by suspicion and resentment, was now united in its determination to build a better future, and Sheriff Miller was proud to be standing alongside them, fighting for justice and accountability. The legal battles that followed were complex and protracted, stretching on for months and dominating the headlines in Willow Creek and beyond. Agnes Plumtree and Bob Jenkins, facing criminal charges of false imprisonment, impersonating law enforcement, and potentially assault, hired a lawyer and pleaded not guilty. Their defense rested on the argument that they were acting in good faith, trying to enforce the HOA rules and maintain the quality of life in Willow Creek. They claimed they had no intention of harming Ethan Miller and that their actions were justified by the HOA bylaws. The HOA board members, facing charges of embezzlement, fraud, extortion, and conspiracy, also pleaded not guilty. Their lawyers argued that they were being unfairly targeted by Sheriff Miller, who had a personal vendetta against them because of the incident involving his son. They claimed that any financial irregularities were unintentional and that they had always acted in the best interests of the community. In addition to the criminal charges, the HOA and its members also faced a barrage of civil lawsuits. Ethan Miller, represented by a high-powered attorney, sued Agnes, Bob, and the HOA for false imprisonment, assault, and emotional distress. Other residents, emboldened by Ethan's example, filed similar lawsuits, seeking damages for the harassment, intimidation, and financial losses they had suffered at the hands of the HOA. The civil lawsuits were particularly damaging to the HOA, as they exposed even more details about its inner workings and its abusive practices. The plaintiffs presented evidence of selective enforcement of the rules, financial mismanagement, and a deliberate campaign to silence dissent. The legal battles took a heavy toll on Willow Creek. The community was divided, with some residents supporting the victims and others defending the HOA. Friendships were broken, families were torn apart, and the once peaceful neighborhood became a battleground. Sheriff Miller, despite facing criticism for his involvement in the case, remained steadfast in his commitment to seeking justice for the victims. He testified at the criminal trials, providing evidence of the HOA's corruption and abuse of power. He also worked closely with the civil attorneys, providing them with information and resources to support their cases. The legal battles were a long and difficult process, but in the end, justice prevailed. Agnes Plumtree and Bob Jenkins were convicted of false imprisonment and sentenced to community service. The HOA board members were found guilty of embezzlement and fraud and sentenced to prison. And the victims of the HOA's abuse were awarded substantial damages in their civil lawsuits. The legal battles were over, but the scars remained. Willow Creek would never be the same. But even with the legal battles concluded and justice seemingly served, Willow Creek remained a fractured community. The events had exposed deep divisions, cleaving the neighborhood into opposing camps. On one side were those who supported Sheriff Miller and the victims of the HOA's abuse, hailing them as heroes who had finally stood up to tyranny. On the other side were those who defended the HOA and its actions, viewing them as well-meaning volunteers who were simply trying to maintain community standards. This division manifested itself in countless ways, both large and small. Heated arguments erupted at community meetings, on social media, and even in the grocery store. Yard signs proclaiming, "Support Sheriff Miller and stand with Willow Creek HOA," sprouted up across the neighborhood. turning the once uniform lawns into political battlegrounds. Some residents ostracized those who had spoken out against the HOA, accusing them of being troublemakers and ruining the community's reputation. Others refused to associate with those who continued to defend the HOA, viewing them as complicit in the corruption and abuse. The divisions even extended to families, with siblings, spouses, and parents and children finding themselves on opposite sides of the issue. Thanksgiving dinners became minefields of unspoken resentments, and holiday gatherings were often canceled altogether. Those who supported the HOA often argued that the victims were exaggerating their experiences or that they had simply failed to follow the rules. They claimed that the HOA was essential for maintaining property values and ensuring a high quality of life in Willow Creek. They accused Sheriff Miller of overreacting and of using the incident involving his son as an excuse to settle a personal score. Those who supported the victims argued that the HOA had become a tool of oppression, used to silence dissent and enrich a select few. They claimed that the HOA's rules were petty and arbitrary, and that its enforcement was often unfair and discriminatory. They praised Sheriff Miller for his courage in standing up to the HOA and for bringing justice to the community. The community division made it difficult to move forward and heal. The wounds were deep, and the resentments lingered. Even after the legal battles were over, the scars remained, a constant reminder of the turmoil that Willow Creek had endured. It would take time, patience, and a concerted effort to bridge the divide and rebuild trust within the community. But the residents of Willow Creek were determined to try. They knew that their future depended on it. Throughout the entire ordeal, Sheriff Miller found himself walking a tightrope, constantly battling accusations of a conflict of interest. While many lauded him as a hero for standing up to the HOA's corruption, others questioned his motives, suggesting that he was using his position to exact revenge for what had happened to his son. The local newspaper ran several editorials questioning whether Sheriff Miller could be impartial in the investigation. Given his personal connection to the case, some residents filed formal complaints with the county ethics board, accusing him of abusing his power and violating the public trust. Sheriff Miller understood their concerns. He knew that his involvement in the case raised legitimate questions about his impartiality, but he also knew that he couldn't stand idly by while the HOA continued to prey on its own residents. He had a duty to uphold the law, and he wasn't going to let personal considerations. Despite the lingering divisions, Willow Creek began to heal. The convictions of Agnes and Bob and the HOA board members brought a sense of closure, a feeling that justice had finally been served. But the legal battles were only the first step. The community also needed to address the underlying issues that had allowed the corruption and abuse to flourish in the first place. One of the first steps was reforming the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. The old bylaws were scrapped, and new ones were drafted with the input of residents and legal experts. The new bylaws emphasized transparency, accountability, and fairness. They established clear guidelines for enforcement, prohibited selective enforcement of the rules, and created a system for resolving disputes fairly and impartially. The new bylaws also limited the power of the HOA board, requiring greater community involvement in decision-making. The board was expanded to include more resident representatives, and term limits were imposed to prevent any one individual from accumulating too much power. The HOA also established a code of ethics for board members, requiring them to act in the best interests of the community and to avoid any conflicts of interest. The Code of Ethics also prohibited board members from using their positions for personal gain or from harassing or intimidating residents. In addition to reforming the HOA, the community also took steps to promote greater awareness of the potential for abuse of power in community associations. Workshops and seminars were held to educate residents about their rights and responsibilities under the HOA bylaws. Legal experts were brought in to explain the laws governing community associations and to provide advice on how to prevent and address abuse of power. The events in Willow Creek also sparked a national conversation about the need for greater regulation of HOAs. Lawmakers in several states began to consider legislation to strengthen consumer protections and prevent abuse of power in community associations. The resolution in Willow Creek was not perfect. The community remained divided, and the scars of the past were still visible. But the convictions, the reforms, and the increased awareness had created a new foundation for the future. Willow Creek was no longer the idyllic, but oppressive, community it once was. It was a community that had learned from its mistakes, a community that was determined to build a better future for itself. Slowly, painstakingly, Willow Creek began to put the pieces back together. With the old guard gone, a new generation of leaders stepped forward to guide the community. The new HOA board was composed of residents who were committed to transparency, fairness, and community involvement. They held regular town hall meetings, soliciting input from residents on all major decisions they made. The HOA's financial records publicly available, ensuring that everyone could see how their money was being spent, and they worked tirelessly to build bridges between the different factions within the community. The atmosphere in Willow Creek began to change. The fear and intimidation that had once permeated the neighborhood began to dissipate. Residents felt more comfortable expressing their opinions, decorating their homes as they pleased, and letting their children play outside without fear of being. The story of Willow Creek serves as a stark reminder that power, even in its most seemingly mundane forms, must be held accountable. It's easy to dismiss the concerns of a homeowners association as trivial, to view their rules and regulations as mere inconveniences. But as the residents of Willow Creek learned, unchecked power, even in a suburban setting, can have devastating consequences. The events in Willow Creek highlight the importance of vigilance, of questioning authority, and of standing up for what is right. Even when it's difficult or unpopular, it's a reminder that we cannot take our freedoms for granted, that we must be willing to defend them, even against those who claim to be acting in our best interests. The story also underscores the importance of community. It was the collective action of the residents of Willow Creek that ultimately brought down the corrupt HOA and paved the way for a better future. It was their willingness to share their stories, to support one another, and to demand accountability that made the difference. And finally, the story of Willow Creek is a testament to the power of justice. Despite the challenges, the setbacks, and the divisions, the legal system ultimately worked, holding those who had abused their power accountable for their actions. It's a reminder that even in the face of adversity, there is always hope for justice, and that we must never give up fighting for what is right. So, the next time you hear about a dispute in a homeowners association, or the next time you encounter a seemingly trivial rule or regulation, remember the story of Willow Creek. Remember the HOA cops and the sheriff's son. Remember the corruption, the abuse, and the community's long struggle for justice. And remember that even in the most ordinary of settings, the principles of accountability, transparency, and fairness must always prevail. For it is only by holding those in positions of authority accountable that we can protect our freedoms and ensure a just and equitable society for all.